Dear participants, remember that we work in Latvian, but questions will be put in part in English, and the presentation will be in English, and you will need simultaneous interpreting. It's possible.
But if you need a translation, then there's some headphones behind you. But the working language will be Latvian. Everything should be translated. I'm really happy that all of you have found some time to be here. Now I'm switching to Latvian. Es ļoti priecājos par to, ka jūs sev laiku dažādos prezidentūras.
I'm very happy that you have found time within your busy schedule of the EU presidency to discuss these issues for the future of the EU. I'm Iveta Kažoka, research expert of Providus, and I will try to moderate your discussions, and we shall do as follows: brief introductory words, and then there'll be a presentation of a new future for the EU that will be presented by Dr. Andrei Stuchlik, and he'll speak English and it'll be interpreted into Latvian, and then we shall ask the experts to comment on this presentation, and then I'll start a much wider discussion. I'll see excellent experts among you who are experts in matters of the EU and also the media, and there are a number of people who have been following the developments in the EU on a day-to-day basis. I expect to see competent comments from you about the future of the EU. Does the EU have enough of ambitions or too many? And what if we meet in some 10 or 20 years, when we look back, we would be able to say, yes, the EU has lived to see positive changes, and we can even predict that they will happen in the faraway 2015. That is the intention of this discussion. And now I'll give the floor to the presenter to speak on this conception, and Andrei will tell us in what way this discussion differs from other discussions we have had, especially the one we had a year ago, what the plans are in respect of this conception in the near and the more distant future. Now I'll give the floor to Andrei to an introductory talk for about 20 minutes. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Iveta. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming and sharing our debate on the new Pact of Europe. What I will basically talk about and would like to present to you, and then looking forward to the discussion with our panelists, is this report, which is called Towards a New Pact for Europe. Now, the report is the same as the project, and so it's a bit difficult to distinguish. What are we doing? Myself, I'm working in Bertelsmann Stiftung. It's the largest German think tank. I'm working in the Brussels office, and together with 13 other foundations and think tanks, we started a project 2 years ago where we wanted to go to the member states and ask citizens, ask stakeholders, ask policymakers, experts, a variety of people upon their preferences in terms of more or less European integration. Now, you may say this is a little bit unusual given the Greece crisis, given the discussion of the United Kingdom leaving the European Union. That is true, but we started our project immediately after the first threat of a Grexit, of a Greek Greek leaving of the Eurozone was sort of mitigated, and we assumed that this crisis we've seen, which started in 2008, is more severe and more far-reaching than the others. And this implies we would need a new foundation, a new founding procedure of what European integration is about, and therefore a new pact for Europe. Technical issues, as always. 1 second. So what I would like to explain in my 15 to 20 minutes is very easy. On the one hand, the rationale, so what is the logic of our project, who are we, why are we doing this? A very short remark on our first paper, which I presented here last year, then what came out of these results of our debates in several member states, the structure of this report, and then the summary and the outlook of what we're doing. And Iveta just mentioned it. The idea is we went to in a number of, I think, 17 member states in a total of 50 events. We had behind closed doors events where policymakers could speak out freely and without hesitation. We asked stakeholders, trade unionists, business corporations, but we also discussed it with citizens. We called it structural citizen dialogues. That means we went, for instance, to Germany or to Portugal and spoke to randomly selected 25 people, randomly selected in terms of education, age, gender. And throughout one day, we continued discussing with them, what do you want in terms of European integration? What do you think the EU should deliver given the current crisis? Is there anything you would need, you would like to be reformed? And if yes, what would it look like? Now, this is, you can't just simply initiate such a debate. It would be far too complicated and too complex. So we initiated and we constructed 5 different speeds of more or less integration. Here's just who we are, the list of the foundations, so that you have an idea how genuinely, how truly European our project is. This is the key objective. I was just saying that we wanted to create a new pact in terms between citizens, but also between member states. So we asked basically 3 questions. Why do we need the EU? In the first place, if we agree upon there's need for collaboration, what is the kind of this collaboration? And thirdly, how should it be done in terms of concrete proposals? We collected, starting from the crisis in 2008, we collected several dimensions of problems in terms of social, political, but also in terms of the external dimension. Why is that? We wanted to have a tableau, a state-of-the-art report of what is it at stake, what are the different, several challenges the member states are facing. Now, this may sound to you perhaps a bit academic, as typical think tank jargon would look like, but the idea behind that was that we have very, very different preferences in the individual member states. When you would ask Dutch policymakers what is the current most important threat to European integration, they will immediately say, well, it's migration. If you talk to policymakers in the UK, it's the single market and nothing else. If you ask people in Athens, as we did a couple of weeks ago, the social dimension is much more relevant. So before we establish a proposal and reform options for European integration, we wanted to have a clear collection. What is, from your perspective, the most pressing problem? Where are the important challenges? And out of these challenges, we created a first paper, and we'll be very brief on this because some of you have it have seen it already and read it already. So we asked people 4 or 5 options. What would you like to do? Would you like to see the European Union develop backwards in terms of going back to the basics, undoing the mistakes of the past, refraining the euro? Or would you rather say, well, these reform initiatives right now, it's just a wrong moment. We have consolidated something. We had seen the introduction of the banking union, for instance. So why not stay around with these achievements and consolidate them first? Or when you think of the Eurozone crisis, would you rather argue, well, this is simply not enough. We may mitigate some of the risks right now, but sooner or later they will pop up again. So in terms of European integration, we'll have to do more, doing it more and better. And so we called this third option as moving ahead ambitiously. Perhaps you could visualize these questions we put in front of citizens in terms of a gearbox, like sitting in a car, and sort of going back to the basics option would be shifting backwards, whereas option number 2 would be more or less staying where you are, and option 3 and 4 would be then to move forward, and option 4 would really mean to move forward in a significant sense. Here we put it as leaping forward, as well. In the very end, the European Union will have to be a kind of truly political and economic union, not just an economic one, but really with genuine political institutions. And finally, we asked people, well, we do understand option number 1, 2, 3, 4 are very standard questions in favor more or less European integration, but perhaps this is the wrong question. Perhaps we have to really rethink traditional views of political representation. Perhaps we'll have to go away from this member state perspective and rather ask what citizens directly could be interested in European integration. This is just what I explained, these 5 strategic options. And we collected these debates and came back to our reflection group, about 15 people compiling this report. So this paper is not a single-authored paper. And we were looking at how to summarize this. Well, what happened? What can we find as a result? And, well, I had to admit it, we've been a bit disappointed, because it wasn't at all easy to create a landscape of preferences. But what was interesting is, or several things are interesting. The general approach of asking people directly has been very much perceived as quite positive. So people are very, very much interested in being asked about the future directions of European integration. So to some extent, this is at odds with the growing skepticism you're witnessing in the European Union. The second result is that option number 2 and option number 5 came out most prominently. So on the one hand, a more status quo driven position of, well, do not pursue any further reforms, try to consolidate it first, a very careful proposal, you'd like to say, and the option number 5, very much oriented towards citizens and their greater involvement. So these 2 have been put forward most. And coming back to what I said at the beginning in terms of challenges and problems, our debate found out, or at the very end of this debate, we saw 2 predominant challenges. The one is fragmentation, and the second is the loss of a win-win situation. What do I mean by that? Fragmentation, on the one hand, means that we see increased heterogeneity in terms of economic, but also in the social sphere, not only in the member states, but also between the member states. It's not just the Brexit or the debate in the United Kingdom, but if you look at social indicators, for instance, you can right now see an increasing divide between northern member states and southern European member states. It's not just about youth unemployment, but it is also the case that specifically the Scandinavian countries, but also Poland and Germany to some extent, have been in the last years able to improve their social welfare system. That means, given the economic situation as it is right now in the southern European member states, this divide will only grow in the next coming years. So this fragmentation is one issue, and the second issue is that throughout our debates, to whoever we talk to, is people responded that today the European integration is not longer considered as what has been in the 80s and the 70s, in the sense that everybody, to some extent, is benefiting from the European integration. It's not distributed equally, but in sum, every member state has a clear advantage of being a member in it. And today, this win-win situation, as we put it forward, seems to be lost. Now, what are we proposing? So what we would like to discuss with you today. We called this report Towards a New Pact for Europe, and we are proposing, or want to debate with you, 3 pillars and one, as we call it, grand project. Enabling, supportive, participatory, and energy union. So this report says basically 2 things. The preferences in the member states in terms of what the European Union, what European integration should deliver, should bring forward to the citizens, are so diverse that we need interconnected realms of instruments. One is enabling. This is the pillar we would put forward in terms of supporting the economy. That means we envisage to strengthen or increase the support for private but also for public investments. We would like to see a strengthening, the strengthening of social investments. And the third example here is that structural reforms in the member states should be complemented by some kind of a European fiscal capacity. Now, this sounds perhaps a bit technical. What does it mean in real terms? The third point is quite clear. If you look at the situation in Italy, in Spain, in Portugal, but predominantly in Greece, the idea behind our project is to say that the crisis, economic as it started and political as it is of today, is so severe and is also linked to some deficiencies in the European construction, that it's not only the fault of national domestic political decision makers, but also they're in triggers and creates a responsibility on the European level. So that means this fiscal capacity would be an EU budget, whether for Eurozone countries alone or for the EU countries, and this would help to some extent buy in those badly needed structural reforms. The second pillar, supportive union, we think that we would need to create a new pact and to regain the support of citizens, a dimension which is a kind of a caring dimension. And this means specifically those being hit most hard by the crisis, those need to be protected specifically. We have here point number 2 and 3, strengthening social minimum standards and social convergence criteria. Again, this may sound technical, and those of you following the European social policy in the last 2 years will duly notice that it has been very, very difficult to introduce something like social Maastricht criteria. DG Employment has tried to do so and failed on the Barroso cabinet. And now with the Juncker Commission, so far there's not much change to be witnessed, but we believe that akin in the same vein as the macroeconomic imbalance procedure, we would need as kind of a social imbalance procedure. The fourth point here is a concrete policy proposal. UBS is not the Swiss bank in this part here, but refers to the European unemployment benefit schemes. This is one initiative being discussed in Brussels and during the last 2 years, where we would introduce a minimum baseline of unemployment insurance on the European level, which will not only have effects in terms of social policy, but will also act as a buffer against cyclical or asymmetric cyclical shocks in European monetary union. The third pillar, I'll come to my conclusion soon, the participatory union. Now here you will see or resemble the fifth option we had in the very beginning, that we consolidated into this pillar and understood, or we believe that we have understood, that citizens in most member states would like to see a greater and direct involvement in European decision-making, whether this being as transnational policy lists in the European Parliament elections, or a direct election of the well, if you think of this Spitzenwahlkampf candidacy of Schulz and Juncker, this will be in the second stage to discuss. But the general reasoning is here to strengthen transparency, to strengthen accountability, and by this means to raise awareness and interest among European citizens to really take part in EU decision-making. The fourth point here, I call it experience the EU, exclamation mark. What does it mean? Well, it means that most studies find that people will only be interested in EU affairs if they really experience the added value of it. It has been in the beginning of the European Monetary Union that people saw the reduction of transaction costs and they saw the liberty in traveling abroad, but this effect crowds out after some amount of time. And even Erasmus students spending a year abroad, they are already, in most cases, very much in favor of the European integration project. So it's other people and perhaps less skilled people and generations we will have to address, and perhaps introducing a kind of European voluntary or civilian service. There are already initiatives in this direction, but we think this would be an important element. I'd like to conclude with a grand project, an energy union. Well, why would we need this? What does it mean? I think there are many, many experts among you to talk on energy issues, and I think the Latvian presidency has witnessed a great conference in February on this topic. So to some extent, the European Commission itself has already overtaken, some of our ideas. But in this context of creating a new pact and increasing also your interest in the EU, the energy union is more or less means to the aim, in a sense that we would like to copy what we've seen with the single market initiative, to start a grand project benefiting all member states, making the European added value visible, and also to work and to act as a trigger element, as a catalyst for perhaps then further spillovers in other policy areas. And finally, I think this element could possibly also help to overcome the cleavage we've seen right now between member states who have the common currency and member states who are outside the Eurozone. So this, together, three pillars and this one grand project will be our proposal to increase the support and the effectiveness of European integration. Thank you very much.
Paldies, Andrei.
Thank you, Andrei. Prior to giving the floor to our panel discussion participants, I'd like to, well, in order to inspire, to share views and opinions about various issues that concern this new pact, this new conception. I have summarized views from many people who are EU experts, either reporters or representatives, NGOs. Most of them are politologists. Unfortunately, they are not here. They do not attend this meeting. And I will attempt to structure their responses about the three major issues that we would like to discuss today, and where I would really welcome the opinion from the panelists and also from other interested parties from the audience. How appropriate, in your view, is this new conception? How appropriately it has perceived the new challenges the EU faces? Your view on the recommendations that Andrei has just presented to you, the development of the three pillars and the energy union, and if there are any other matters that should be placed in the center of the further European integration, however, they have not been included in this in this document. I will briefly summarize, well, the opinion expressed by 8 people who unfortunately couldn't attend, experts on EU affairs. First, on the appropriateness how the challenges are described, 2 views. There's a group of experts who believe that these challenges have been diminished. The EU actually encounters far more serious challenges that do not manifest only themselves as the internal fragmentation or else as the fact that the feeling is lost that all the citizens stand to win something from the European integration, so the win-win situation lost. What is mentioned as the missing focal points is the severe geopolitical situation. We do not know what will happen if Russia becomes more radical. What happens if the UK really leaves the EU? And the third issue raised by one of the experts is almost all the plans and conceptions for the further development of the EU, including this concept, has been quite introvert, built on the further development of institutions, and it is less than the EU could do in further global world and global policy. The other group of views is that this concept is very appropriate and it has pinned down all the painful issues, the huge fragmentation that's in evidence, and the loss of the feeling of common vision. Yet at the same time, they are not convinced that the conception offers some new, strong solutions that are in principle different from what's proposed by Juncker's plan, or perhaps that gives some new answers to questions put to date. Questions that have been sent by experts concerning this new concept are as follows.
I'll just mention to inspire you to debate. As to investments, almost all say that without rapid growth, the EU will become a peripheral region, although it is not clear where to take the resources for great investments in the EU member state economy. As to social issues, some experts are skeptical. Yes, that has been the model of the EU before, but it might be also very strange for those countries that haven't got resources, at least not to a level that the Scandinavian countries may afford, and some governments actually cannot follow it up. As to participation in the EU, some experts say say that that's the right way, but at the same time, the ideas that come along, for example, to vote at the EU Parliament, to vote for the EU political parties, or bigger possibilities for the local parliaments to follow how their governments introduce their wishes at the EU level, that this is something that is not very inspiring for the ordinary people, and it will not solve the democracy issue. The same experts do not offer any alternative. If you have any ideas, you are welcome to speak up. As to the energy union, I've got a number of opinions. Mostly, the experts say, yes, that is very much needed for Latvia and for the EU. What they doubt is whether it's really inspiring. Is it really a grand project that could renew the whole of the EU and enthusiasm in the future of the EU? One expert, we had a close discussion with members of parliament. For Latvia, the way of development would be closer is to have also some joint security and external policy at the level of the whole of the EU, alongside with the energy union project. This is a summary of those opinions that have been sent to me in written form. And now we pass over to the basic evaluation. Each of the panelists have got 10 minutes at your disposal. You may split it up in several goes, and it's up to you whether you focus on the big questions, whether the challenges are shown correctly, what about the recommendation, is that an alternative? And my request is to try to keep to the 10 minutes. And I would like to give the floor to Mr. Pauls Raudseps, a commentator of the magazine ENG, and he often writes on big EU issues. That's why we are interested how you view this new conception. Thank you very much, Iveta. I listened with great interest. I would like to say, when I listen to your proposals, I find this vision very much to my liking in many ways, but how much of it is realistic? What should we emphasize? Perhaps the first question, how adequate are the formulations of the problems in the EU today? Fragmentation is there. People don't use the win-win, don't feel the win-win situation, really. These are the two manifestations of a very big problem that we see in many contexts in the EU, namely the problem that peoples of the EU do not feel mutual solidarity in many questions that is necessary to solve some of the new problems that have sprung up in the EU when this integration process is continuing. There is a shortage of solidarity, a lack of it. We saw it when we discussed the budget framework for 7 years. We saw it in the questions about the debt of Greece. And then we can compare the EU with the USA, in which in Latvian are nearly the United States. each state of the USA actually was a sovereign unit, and they gave up this sovereignty, and this way there is a transfer from the rich states to the weaker states. This is a huge process. In the EU, no state would be ready to do it. That's not possible within the framework of the EU, and that would answer many of the questions about social policies. That is a system that exists in the EU. Many of the social questions, pensions, unemployment benefits, and other benefits are divided by the federal government, and they come from the federal government budget. And the unemployment benefits and the benefits for the poor are transferred, and nobody really is upset about that. However, it helps to divert the economic crises that we have experienced in the EU of late. With the present structure of the EU and the lack of feeling of solidarity, it is very hard to imagine even that something similar could be introduced in the EU, although it would be desirable because it would solve the problems of the economic cycle that exists in a number of countries, and what we see in the Eurozone, that some countries may go bankrupt if they get into a recession. If this kind of support existed, this support would establish closer ties and solve economic problems. Unfortunately, it is unfortunate, and it spoils the relationship between countries, and in the economic crisis that are also there in the paying countries who want to diminish their payment into the EU. I don't know whether politically this kind of step is possible. What seems to me a very good proposal, that is the emphasis on the energy union. That is good. I think this is one of the alternatives how to give a positive impulse to the thoughts about EU integration. First of all, we can renew this feeling. The energy union, if it is done correctly, would allow us to diminish our costs of energy. We pay less, everybody, and if things may be compensated here from one source to another, there is some practice in this direction in the EU, and the EU should work more actively in it, and that would give a side effect, a good side effect, that it would enhance a feeling of solidarity. We all have common interests. There are also some very good things with it, is that energy and foreign policy, that very often also foreign policy here was mentioned, that's not very inspiring and so on. We know that the energy relationship of the EU and Russia is one of the challenges, and also Libya and other eastern and southern neighboring countries. By establishing the energy union, we would be able to address one of our main foreign objectives. When we speak about solidarity, the European Commission has already worked out a piece of research what would happen if Russia all of a sudden stopped all the supplies of gas to the EU. How could we compensate the losses, also helping each other from one country to another? That would also demand solidarity from the countries involved.
If supplies are stopped for one country, and in actual fact, another country has to share gas to support another country anyway. So it means that we have to tighten the belts to be able to do this. At the moment, there's no mechanism in the EU how to accomplish this. There is a model how it might be done, but no country is under obligation to waive their gas supplies in favor of the neighbors. If we could take this further step, that would be a very significant step towards overall solidarity of the EU and common energy security. That would also give us the feeling of security that's really necessary. I believe in the report, the emphasis and the indication that that is really a direction where the EU could work to get the impetus and also the impulse for further cooperation. I think that's very good, and I believe all the priorities that have been identified should be supported. But as concerns solidarity, where you can clearly identify all the payments, where you can identify the social payments in view of the current situation, I think that would be very difficult to do. Thank you, Paul. Now I'll give the floor to Ms. Ilze Rūse, Head of the Department of European Affairs, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And she's also a lecturer and a person whom I've heard legends about, who is capable of training a large number of civil servants, so I think 335 people at one go about EU matters. And I believe so she is the one person to show you that there are things to aspire to achieve. And we would like to listen to your observations concerning these matters. Thank you. And first, I'd like to say that they're very glad to participate in discussion, not because during the presidency our European Affairs Department is looking for jobs, but because I put aside all my tasks and decided to come here because such discussions are of paramount importance for presiding country, because the way we look at significant philosophical issues about the future of the EU, I believe for us as presiding country, we have a 6-month perspective, because each presiding country wants to achieve success during this presidency. But these are very significant issues, and I would really like to discuss these matters not only from a strategic point of view, but also from point of our presidency. First, I would like to put a counter question to the researchers, because I believe, and I felt intrigued, and I read the whole study in full, and it was interesting to see how it is merged, the challenges and the crisis merged into overall definitions. I've got a question. Do you think that the crisis is the cause of fragmentation, or crisis is the consolidator of fragmentation? When we remember the huge discussion what Europe is going forth, and so the integration of EU's Schuman plan, which envisaged automatic transition from one to another, so spillover, the spillover effect in a way. In English, it's a very nice term, and it seems that at one moment political integration becomes self-regulatory. And in this case, the argument would be that during the crisis, countries consolidate and become more united. In some way, those who have read also about the model of the United States, also it was born at a very difficult moment. This is a fundamental question: whether the crisis is our opportunity. And I will now leave the ball on the side of the audience. That might be one of the challenges during the discussion. But while we to continue more specific about our perspective, 6-month perspective of our presidency, I'd like to say the following. In the academic community, very often we speak about ends and means. What is the means and what's the cause? Whether the EU is means or it's already an end in itself, an objective in itself, another issue for discussion. But in response to Iveta's question, when we put together the ends and the means in this context, I agree to authors of the research study. At the moment, the huge challenges for the EU is the effectiveness of the EU, the ability of the EU to react, and the leading role of the EU in the world. I do not want to add it to our priorities, but I perceive also the handwriting of our presidency, because our one leitmotif is to ensure engage Europe. And this is one of those responses to the way to question how we perceive Europe. Where authors of the research study speak about means, how these objectives are to be achieved, because any ship traveling in high seas or the sailing boat actually drifts, and if you do not have the direction pointed out, you drift for a long time. And I believe one of the failings, or perhaps one of the matters that we have to be aware of, is a strategic vision, and the strategic vision in the meaning of where will your energy union lead us to. I do not see it as an end. I see it as a means. And these 3 items that are offered by the research study, I would amplify by strategic thinking of Europe. And I would say the process is underway, because in the last meetings of the Council of the European Union, so there was an agreement on 5 issues which will be important in the coming 5 years. This agreement was passed by the Council of the European Union. It was not a supranational project. This is a project supported by the governments of all our countries. And also in formulating our presidency, we took a very strict view so that the excess strength is wasted somewhere, but we have to focus on consolidation. You cannot have many similar priorities. You must have some priorities, and this is what you have to focus our skills on. For example, you mentioned energy union. Definitely, by all means, is one of those strategic matters that's relevant. Another matter is that every citizen has a job, has blossoming economy, so that our products have export markets in other countries. That's something that I lack in this research study, but this already happened. It's taken place. It means that Europe is moving faster than when we can forecast. On 8th of January, when we started presidency, the European Commission came forward with the investment plan, which stated that the dormant money in the banks will be released, and it will be entered into the circulation to establish jobs, and by the end of the presidency, we should have clear preconditions or legal basis how it will all operate. And I consider it as important as energy union. And one of the important issues, which is important for the citizens as well as for the European strategic thinking, and I agree with speakers, is security. Security in the widest sense of the word, external security as well as human safety internally, security against terrorism. And when we speak about actorness, ability of Europe to react, the time that takes Europe to get all the resources together to ensure security, whether we can do it tomorrow by morning, if something has happened last Thursday. So this is where the unity of the European Union comes into play and its efficiency. All the elements that have been incorporated in the research study have been interconnected and they are very relevant. So the geopolitical context was mentioned, strategic communication has been mentioned, but actually factually there are things which are outdated in Europe. That earliest security policy was approved in 2003, so more than 10 years ago, and Latvian presidency will work along these lines so that to give some signals for the coming presidencies at the Council of the European Union in June. My conclusion is that the EU is a moving target, and it's a good thing that it's so, but it would be far worse if the European Union was a stagnate, sitting duck, and we could put it in the context on one research study, what the presidency is doing in this case. So to ensure that the EU operates better, we work with specific issues. Latvian presidency is very pragmatic. We work with very specific issues to make European institutions more functional, and the results that perhaps may be achieved after our presidency, but we started quite a lot of initiatives aimed at improving functionality of the EU institutions. My criticism, perhaps, of the research study is directed towards the conclusions. I don't think the agreement shouldn't be changed. I think quite a lot can be used already within the existing agreements, because any agreement that is amended and altered will generate a discussion which very soon will gather various elements like stone gathers moss, and we will lose the strategic issues. And this is what we have to achieve by the means at our disposal currently. That's why my belief and the handwriting of our presidency is pragmatic action to the benefit of functional Europe with what we have. Thank you. And now I'll give the floor to Filips Lastovskis, who is doctoral student of the University of Latvia, and he is also a reporter of Portal. And at the time when I looked for opinion of EU experts about this document, one of the most critical views came from Philip. And I hope that he will bring in the necessary diversity into our discussion, and hopefully in an overall positive coloring, he will also add some notes to this. Yes, so expectations are very high, and I'll hope to meet them as well as I can. I will start with the first issue, whether the problems have been identified correctly, as well as the prerequisites and how the EU should reform itself. I don't think it has been done well in this case. A very beautiful scenario has been drawn what the EU might look like in future if Europeans really cared about the EU. The reality is that this is not actually the case. What I want to say is that the concept discusses many problems that perhaps could be more identified as short-term problems for such a phenomenon as the EU. We'll speak about banking crisis, we'll speak about populists, we'll speak about the debt crisis and the fragmentation of countries. However, at the basis, the EU has its citizens, and at the moment also EU institutions. This has been recognized by the scholars, and this is also a subject of academic discussion. The EU institutions do not enjoy the democratic legitimacy, and if you do not have this basis of democratic legitimacy, it means that we can hardly formulate any future ambitions about future development of EU. Otherwise, we are building a huge, beautiful castle for people who do not want to live it at all. Primarily, we have to understand why, starting when 1979, during the 8 elections to European Parliament, their absenteeism during the elections is growing. So why more and more mass media attention is paid to issues which are related to the EU? Why people very often do not read the news about the EU? And the rank-and-file person, I don't speak about the elite, but I speak of father or family at a supper table with the family. When we go home, we usually discuss the most important events of the day. Usually they are concentrated on our daily life and also national issues, benefits for young mothers, traffic accidents. We do not speak about legislation that affect us, which is also related to institutions. And I believe in this document this has been ignored. As concerns problems that I perceive here, and I really perceive them, one of the main theses is that the challenge is that we have to restore unity within the EU. Then I have a question to the authors. What unity you speak about? What do you want to restore in the EU? Do we take a view from Maastricht, or do we have post-war Europe 1950s? The EU member states have always thought as national countries. They have not thought within the framework of united, larger entity. But what do we have to restore and regain? Another problematic issue is, I like what Ms. Rūse said, that we should have a more strategic vision. And I would like to amplify this thought. And I would like to say that the EU is actually built on papers. We have got so many agreements. We have amended them. We have got votes taken, votes rejected. And there is EU Strategy 2020, which identifies several priorities, what the EU should look like by 2020. In principle, such a document and such a plan should form a synergy with such new concepts that are being developed. But in this case, I did not see any references or perhaps any mention, this Strategy 2020 should be taken into account. Strategy 2020 speaks about employment, education, climate change. All these are issues perhaps have been pushed further in the conception. If we in some dimension X assume that the conception is fine, then when we read the text, I read the full version, very beautiful language, thank you to authors, but it's a bit from science fiction, but it seems that the plan has been formulated in sort of neo-functionalism style. It's a theory which envisages some specific stimulation, some specific economic sector will automatically lead to deeper political integration, which will lead to spillover effect. This is strategy usually applied by Euro optimists, and we can also identify that the specific sector that should lead to closer political integration is energy union. However, is it really such a grand project that could be this uniting factor? I have doubts about it. So if we really have both in one sector that could lead to closer unity, then we should really have considerable unanimity among their member states. But if we spark the energy union, member states cannot reach an agreement. There's diversity of opinion, because the sector of energy is very important for each member state as a single item, a commodity that we can trade in and we can import from third countries, and actually it's perceived as an individual opportunity of trade. And member states, I wonder if they are ready to give it up, especially if we emphasize such countries as Hungary, Cyprus, Slovakia, which are far more skeptical about it, to surrender it. So for this grand project to work, we have a project on banks, which is the second most important project, perhaps not as complicated as energy union. And if this banking project hasn't given this feeling of integration, so why should this energy union give this sense of unity?
I return to the basic question. We make up big projects without realizing that people are not interested in them. What should we do? What about recommendations? We need to say that we often forget that there have been many recommendations in the history of the EU, and we forget the conclusions. Now, in 2005, France and the Netherlands, when both of the countries said no to the constitution of the EU, and then there was Lisbon, and then there was a big think tank why it failed. The idea was good, the constitution was good, we did everything correctly. Where is the mistake? That's the way we informed the society, the people. We need to think about that much more. The EU gives grounds to the EU that they should speak about it in the public space, in the media. There should be given more information. We haven't seen that that people have become more interested after 2005. No, so it is much more important to speak more about the information process. Thank you very much, Philip. You justified the expectations. Now we could start the discussion. Perhaps we should give a possibility to Andrei. Perhaps he would like to say something straight away. We can give you the floor. If not, we can get down to the discussion. What do you think? Before Andrei starts speaking, we are saying to those in the internet, we are online, use the hashtag Pact for Europe, or else write to Providus.lv. And now 2 minutes to Andrei to react to the most important points expressed here. Thank you.
I'd like to cover direct questions addressed to me. So therefore, the first one, crisis as a cause of fragmentation, or rather an opportunity to consolidate, to strengthen European integration. And, well, this may sound as a cheap way out, but it's both at the same time. Because to some extent we would say the increased fragmentation triggered by the economic crisis right now makes it much more difficult to reach consensus, despite the fact what we've seen, and Philips is perfectly correct about the importance of the banking union, what we've seen so far. So from our perspective, this political as well as social fragmentation is rather an hindrance and rather an obstacle to pursue further steps. If you think of treaty revision, and I think the report is very modest in that respect. So most of our proposals, as is correctly stressed, could be initiated and legislated on the Lisbon Treaty provisions already. Even the fiscal capacity in I think taking Article 127, that would be possible. So because we would not like too early to open up Pandora's box and starting treaty negotiations. But it is I think the most critical question of today is exactly that. Is it fragmentation, the obstacle, the key obstacle, or is it just, as if you think of the history, and you stressed that, of the US, rather a consolidating, a crisis element, and then it goes further on in terms of integration. The second point, a sailing boat that drifts if it lacks a vision. That is correct. we could, on the other hand, argue that the European Union Treaty has a vision, has very clear goals in terms of environment, in terms of social protection, think of the social market economy. This is also a reference to what Philip said regarding the EU 2020 strategy. So it would be unfair to say that the European Union lacks a vision. It rather has too much of it, because it has many, many goals, and these do not reflect or do not translate very concretely in policy proposals, or simply think of the asymmetry of the legal base when it comes to economic issues and when it comes to social issues. And very briefly to the last panelist, thank you very much for this criticism. You can imagine among our reflection group and among our debates, we raised many of these issues. But it's fair to say, and I want to be very open about this, this is a project of European foundations doing European projects, working in Brussels. Yes, on balance, they are not neutral in a normative way. We are in favor of European integration. So many of these proposals are a means to the end of strengthening European integration. This is also part of the answer to Ilze. We are optimists, but I wouldn't say it's naive neo-functional thinking. The energy union is, and this is a criticism which is valid, could be perceived as, well, this is standard procedure. Well, you did it with the single market, you create something too big to understand by the people, and then it evolves, it grows, and triggers other integrationary steps. That would be a cynical position, almost a cynical position, but we think that this is, as you put it, a rather positive impulse to show the added value of the European integration. Why do we need this in the first place? And this, with my final remark, even the common currency, I think I said it in the beginning, created a positive image. People looked at the common currency and knew it helped them in traveling, reducing transaction costs for business, etc. But this effect, this positive affection crowds out over time. And this would also happen with energy in terms of, well, you have lower prices, but after a while, you as a citizen will forget who is responsible for this lowering of the prices. And this, I think, to some extent also explains or gives an answer to your question why people are not interested in European politics or European affairs. I take 3 countries, Hungary, Slovakia and Croatia. You have very, very low voter turnout to European elections. True. At the same time, if you ask people, to whom do you trust, European citizens, European institutions or domestic institutions? They're much more in favor of European institutions. So it is also an issue of still some kind of permissive consensus. Yes, European affairs is done by the elites, by the government. I do not have to care as much. So it's a kind of rational ignorance, which is also of matter here. Thank you.
Paldies. Un tagad gan mēs varētu sākt plašāku diskusiju.
And now we could start a wider discussion. My colleagues will help me with the mic. I hope the questions that we need opinions are 3. Firstly, do you think that the diagnostics of the problem is correct? If not, what would be a better solution? What do you think about these recommendations, about the 3 ways? More investments, more social care, more involvement of people in decision-making, and the grand project of energy union. And thirdly, is there any trend or direction that a close integration is necessary, that every citizen would gain from it, or there is something that has not occurred to us and hasn't been emphasized enough? I understand that we have representatives from various bodies. Please, if you have something to say, please raise your hand and we shall give you the floor. Who would like to start? Anybody? Mrs. Peterson? Microphone for the speaker. The speaker is not speaking in the microphone. That's okay, that's better. Excuse me, there is some kind of echo. It is most difficult to present a piece of research. I would agree to the characterization of the situation. I think this is an internal view of the problems without the geopolitical context in which the EU has to act. That's why there are social and political difficulties. I am skeptical about those formulations that this solution would give every single citizen of the EU something. I know that in Latvia that I would like to see the way forward. It's not only the energy project, how to put this way forward in a total picture. No. Impossible. Impossible. There is a croaking sound. We don't hear. There's a cracking sound. The mic is cracking instead of sounding. It is breaking the ears. And it doesn't work the way it should be.
Es gribēju stādīties priekšā. Tagad var dzird, jā, vai tagad...
It's okay now. Thank you very much. I would like to. I am director of the Institute of Latvia, and among other things, my institute is also involved in questions of reputation and branding. What is the reputation of the European Union outside it? And the problem is that the internal process of Europe that we have been discussing, if we look at them closer and we look at the image of the EU in many countries that are undergoing a very complicated process internally, the Mediterranean countries or the eastern countries, starting with Russia and part of Ukraine, and to see what has been happening there. Has the EU, will the EU cope with it all alone? We have lost the Europe-centric world. We have lost the values that lie at the basis of the EU: democracy, human rights, because we think that these values are self-evident in the EU, but they're not self-evident in all those other countries. And the question is whether Europe has become a kind of enemy in part of the world. What about the worsening of the image of the EU? Can't we influence this? Have we got a strategy to improve the image of the EU? What rhetoric should we use? can we really offer anything reasonable about the communication, the new media, the role of the new media, changes in the strategic thinking have taken place. On the other hand, we see that it is important that Europe should regain its capacity as a global player. Otherwise, we shall not be able to change its image in those other countries. These problems appeared very sharply in 2013, as Mrs. Rūse said, that Europe has become a moving target, and must see that over the last year the world has changed so very rapidly that we are lagging behind with all the documentation. Irrespective of this pessimism, I would like to say to Mr. Lastovskis, if you care for the EU, that's your sentence. In Latvia, we do care for the EU. It's a union of those countries who have been able to solve very complicated political and economic questions without any war or hostilities. We do care, and this way we have some certain grounds for optimism. Thank you very much.
So I believe the question was about questions from the audience. Thank you, Mr. Bartolin. The European-Russian initiative. To be quite honest, if I remember from history, the European Union at the very beginning discussed coal, steel union. Now, so energy, banking, what's the difference? Almost no difference. Only the founding fathers of the European Union, Jean Monnet, Robert Schuman, they still had some vision about values, and the economic union took place at its own level. But after the Second World War, it was quite clear to everybody why European countries united around certain values. I believe now, well, it seems that some Marxist inclination is dominating. There's an economic base, which is primary, and there is superstructure, which seems to depend on the base. And if everything is fine with the economy, then the perceptions, the superstructure, philosophies and perceptions and views will develop automatically. And I believe that now we see that it doesn't happen, it doesn't take place. And if we ask, what's the dream of Europe, or the European dream, like we have the American dream, then it's quite difficult to really say. I think that if we speak about any reformation, any reforms, we have to speak about strategy. And if we take a very casual look, I haven't studied it in detail, but judging by the presentation, we can also draw the conclusion that there are some that's offer of solutions at some strategic level. Then there's another tactical level, what to do with the Russian threat, and so on and so forth. And yet, prior to the development of strategy, we have to speak about values, about ideas, and about the framework. And to be quite honest, until we have so the idea of united idea, so what the European dream, well, for me that's a federative Europe. And how safe it is to discuss now federative Europe. Jean-Claude Juncker said somewhere that for him it's also a value. At any rate, in very practical terms, sometimes I go through the internet looking for a meme that shows Euro-optimism. I found an awful lot of Euro-pessimism, and the only thing is the flag, European Union flag with the stars, is the only optimistic picture I've found. Why so? Because objectively, Europe is still very attractive from people from other worlds, the living standards, the welfare level. But why? Why is there no positive European idea, the European dream? I think here, well, that would be field for work, where Latvia should also contribute by activity, by offering forum for discussion. Thank you. Thank you very much. Are there any comments from the whole audience? If not, we'll go back to the panel. So take the opportunity to express your views if you see any other direction for the European Union, or you would like to comment any of the statements you heard. Tom Message from Lat Telecom, Head of Legal Department, I believe. Thank you to the European House for the invitation. I have listened to this discussion, and I'm somewhat surprised that I have been invited to participate, because my expertise concerns areas where I have worked professionally. Well, that's the telecommunication market and the mass media market, and perhaps some other aspects. And most probably I would not be the right person to ask to speak about the diagnostics and the solutions that are offered in this document. Well, I assume that they are correct, because people have worked on them, experts have worked on them, but I have a question as a result of these discussions. Does it really help, in general, the citizens of the European Union to take a different look at European affairs? The previous speaker spoke about the European dream or the European values. In my view, when you look at the history of the European Union, that since the end of the Second World War, everything was quite clear. But most probably for many people, this European dream seems to have been already achieved, because the European community was established to ensure lasting peace and welfare. And peace stood first, because the beginnings of the European Union are found immediately after the Second World War. For some people, some people may take it for granted that member states actually live in mutual peace. In Eastern Europe, perhaps the sentiments might be different. So I believe we have to remind ourselves about the fundamentals, also the citizens of the European Union, the basis that the European Union was built on. It was not established to split up the European funds or to use the budgets. And I believe what Mr. Lastovskis said about the information of the population, I think this is missing. It's quite difficult to speak to the population in a language of civil clerks, civil servants, and they find it difficult to understand. I don't see any link with the values. If we are more specific, I believe the European Union has one significant challenge, is the global competitiveness. And the advantage of the EU format is that in the ideal variant, it's capable of global competition and also face these challenges of global competition. Whether the member states in the conditions of global competition can compete alone, that's highly doubtful. I believe that the larger EU member states, I believe, are weak competitors in global sense. And please remember, there's such global players who would be very happy if the European Union faced disintegration processes and there were splits experienced, and these players with global, it means that this player with global tendencies actually becomes weaker, and I believe quite a lot of people in this world will be only happy about it. If we speak about specific projects, as a representative of my own sector, I would say that also the single digital market, which is the ambition of the current European Commission and the current Latvian presidency, is also a good competitor for a European project, mostly because it's related to global competitiveness of Europe, and where Europe and member states also lag behind from North America, from Asia, lag behind Asia, and actually they lag behind, they can't go step in step, and mostly because in telecommunications and in the digital sector is the one which is actually horizontally integrating. It applies to all other sectors, and in the ideal variant it can stimulate the growth of other sectors. Secondly, these categories are understandable also for rank-and-file citizens of the EU. Everybody wants to have fast-track internet, easy accessibility of the internet, and these are things easier to maintain than energy. And I believe quite a lot of people are interested in the tariffs for energy, so that there is cheap gasoline and so. But I believe that digital competitiveness would be perhaps more attractive. And if we look at how earlier commissions have worked with the digital market, and how they have succeeded in the earlier years, I can't say it was a success story. And in my view, one of the reasons was that there's an assumption that something can be achieved in Europe by regulating. By regulation, the more good regulations we have, the more success we have. And the industry very often proves the opposite, that complicated bureaucratic regulation complicates everything, especially in such dynamic sectors in telecommunications, and they lag behind reality, because here the innovations and developments take place much faster. And while Europe manages to go through the mills of bureaucracy and come to some common regulation, in reality everything is absolutely different. And everything works different in reality, and new needs appear. In this respect, the global debate is also shown by the specific issues, issue in the United States. So the discussions about data neutrality, I believe, is also very important. So, but anyway, we see the opportunities and possibilities. And this is another area which shows that one by one member states lag behind global competition, and it's a bit of a shame for European countries and European economies, which have always been leaders in innovations and technologies, and all of a sudden it turns out in Asia, so the developments are much faster than can be achieved by Europe, also due to investment potential, regulatory obstacles, and so on. Definitely there are also objective reasons for the situation. In summary, I would like to say that it would be worthwhile returning to the roots in these discussions, reminding ourselves what we have at the basis of this united Europe, and in future we should move towards solutions which are effective, while less heavy-handed, less bureaucratic, and that could give real, tangible results for all citizens.
Savu jautājumu par to, kāpēc jūs tikāt aicināts, Latvijā diemžēl nav.
Thank you very much. You have answered the question that you put yourself. When I read your article, it seemed to me that you are one of those persons who can do it. Your question was very good. What lies at the basis of the EU? Of course, understandings differ. If we compare Latvia with some older member states, then in the older states, they associate the EU with peace and welfare. In the new countries, very often it is the rapid development and the question of structural funds. In our region, the question is, how do we get the taste of a joint Europe, of a united Europe that doesn't depend on these factors alone? In Western Europe, we really cannot expect that the older states will preserve the same mood that you need to be need solidarity with newer countries and the countries that are not so rich. And also what you said about peace, that this question has been left aside. Now, I would like to ask a question to Andrei. How was this conception worked out? Did you think or did you not think about some of the ideas that were mentioned here? The first was the question, what is meant by leaping forward in connection with the investment program? What about the authors of the conception? Have they tried to offer some new ideas that are not in the process of implementation in Juncker's plan? Is it possible to do something that the EU should develop much quicker in the future? The second question about the global view, that we don't see the EU as one of the most powerful actors in the global world, so that Europe should not become a periphery in 20 years, but will remain one of the most dynamic economic questions. And that's was a conscious choice to focus on the internal questions of the EU instead of looking this feeling of the EU in total activities. And thirdly, the idea about the European dream, that the people live fairly well in the EU, that in comparison with other regions of the world, but they do not think about it. They don't appreciate their human rights and their welfare. What are the uniting moments in questions of values? And finally, the questions that call for fundamental replies, but we must reply briefly here about alternative. Is there an alternative to the energy union? We have heard two of them. One direction is to look at joint foreign policy of the EU, and the second, perhaps the average citizen of the EU will understand it better. For example, that to think about a united digital market that would be make the digital services much cheaper in Latvia. When you decided that the energy project was decided to be a grand project, did you look at these other alternatives? Now I have sprinkled you with questions. I hope that you'll be able to take them in some 10 minutes. Thank you.
Well, I'll do it in two. Well, thank you very much for this array of questions. First of all, we published our report in November 13. I think Juncker came 1 month later, but that's obviously is a cheap answer. No, we support this idea, but our idea with this enabling union and with a greater solidarian aspect of how economic policy within the EU should be run, then I think differs from what Juncker has proposed. First of all, there is little genuine EU money which has been earmarked for it. It is more or less done by leverage and by credits from the European Investment Bank. So that would be one difference. The second difference would be that we very much more focus on strengthening also public investment, not only private, but also public investment, and also specifically towards social investing. That means towards individual skills and educational purposes. And the third difference to what the European Commission is actually already doing is that we very much believe in this idea of compensating member states in their process of structural reforms. Now, why does this sort of technical issue matter? I think it matters because currently, if you look at Greece and the discussion over what to do with Greece debt, one day after the elections in Athens, on, I think, well, what was it, 26th of January, the Financial Times had two pieces on its comment pages. One was more or less halve the debt and keep the Eurozone running. And the other one was like negligence Europe cannot afford. Why I'm mentioning this? I'm mentioning this to display the fact that even in academic economic reasoning, there is no consensus on what triggered the first economic or financial and then economic and debt crisis in the Eurozone member states. And this is relevant because when Wolfgang Schäuble meets with the Portuguese finance minister, as recently he did in Berlin on our conference, or when he meets Yanis Varoufakis, the narrative of what has caused the crisis very much differs, and this hinders, so it's sort of also fragmentation in terms of narratives. This, of course, hinders the common solution for a solidarity mechanism. So I think in that respect, our project is very much normative because we are saying, well, yes, a part of what has led to the situation we have today is also due to respect of institutional problems of the Eurozone setup, and not only to be blamed to domestic policymakers. The internal view, was it a conscious choice? Well, in fact, the Ukraine crisis hit us by surprise. At the very beginning, when we set up this reflection group and started our deliberations and then went with this options paper to the member states, the Ukraine crisis was very much at the beginning. And as a summary out of what happened in the debates in the member states, we tried to consolidate this list, this state of affairs paper, if you like. And I have to admit it, security issues, the global role of the EU in terms of multilateral debates as a norm entrepreneur when it comes to human rights issues, WTO, etc. All this has been perceived by these people we talked to and our reflection group as to be less relevant than this internal view. But I can see that our starting point was this economic crisis. So to some extent we've been a bit biased in the very beginning, but throughout the process, obviously these issues and environment also has been as a complete dimension somehow neglected at the very beginning. So throughout this process we took up several of these discussions, and I think the external role of the EU, and this goes then along with its image, how it is perceived outside, is I think now better corroborated in this text, and will, as this is not the only time that it comes up in the discussion, I will then also incorporate it in our final document, where there will be in June 17th concluding conference in Brussels, where we then try to take on together all these debates, such as this one today. The European dream. Yeah, the $1 million question, but a very, very good one, and a very, legitimate one. You said, I think this is very striking, and this also goes a bit into what you meant with the energy union. You said, more or less, it doesn't seem to work anymore to create a political unification moment with the means of an economic project, if I got it correctly. And it would work if we would just have this European dream. Now, I think we cannot exaggerate Europeans' role. At some point, we have to admit it started out as an economic beneficial club membership for a very selected amount of member states. If I would right now go back to my home country, to Germany, and run an opinion poll on the question, what do you think? Would it be better to finance universities by the federal budget or by the Länder budget? Nobody would be interested in that question. But we assume and we expect European citizens to discuss exactly these questions on the EU level. I think that's expected a bit too much. But the problem the EU has, it has to be justified continuously. In this German example, it doesn't matter because the German federal system is just as it is, and it will not has to be justified during the next election. But with the European integration, we have this moving target. We have its product, its regulatory impact, its reduction of costs, its sort of visible symbols. And at the same time, the firm, if you like, sort of the concept, what is the EU as such, as a political constitution. And this, you perhaps remember one of our foreign ministers in 2005, he said, well, finally, no pun intended, the finalité discussion is over. Because if you remember this, people in 2005, they expected, now we have the constitution, now it's done. We'll never have again these questions. But so you're obviously correct, this hope has not been fulfilled. So I think European dream is a bit unfair because people usually don't take the outside view, and European social model, its protection for human rights, its values enshrined in the Charter as well as in the European treaties. This is a kind of, it's more than symbols, it is substance of a European dream, which is quite distinct from how the US would conceive and would consider their welfare system. The final question, well, yes, we thought about other projects, other grand projects. Common security and defense policy is, we looked at it as a very thorny issue, started on several occasions, actually been at the very core in 1955, then if you think of the Saint-Malo initiative in 2000, so it seemed to us to be a little bit loaded with some bad heritage, if you allow me this expression. The other alternative, the digital market, yes, important, but from our perspective, too much linked to the Eurozone and to this purely economic perspective. And so we wanted to have something which would overcome this cleavage between member states who have the common currency and those who don't. And a final critique on the digital market, but this to some extent also applies to the energy union, I'm afraid. In research, we're used to work with this phrase of negative integration. And this is what the single market and what the integration of services, etc., is all about. That's true, but this is has limited appeal to citizens. I once met the Director General of DG Markets in Brussels, and I asked this, I think, from a citizen's perspective, very humble question. So, to what extent helps the single market the national GDP? So how beneficial is it for me from a German or Austrian, whatever perspective, to be part of the single market? And she looked at me quite frightened, what kind of an indecent question I was posing at her. But her reaction is understandable because it's so difficult to calculate this. If you would ask a member of the German parliament, what do you think, to what extent is German legislation initiated or induced or inspired by EU legislation? You will trigger, I don't know, you will have a special issue in an academic journal to find a common ground how to calculate and how to measure it. So it's really difficult. And from that perspective, I think initiatives like the digital market will not be able to create this element, what we wanted to have in this report, that something which can create affection, in the sense as security is very, well, hard to nail down, but still something completely different than a simple regulatory impact in terms of reduced costs of roaming or whatsoever. Thank you.
Vai kādam ir pēdējās minūtes replikas, tie varbūt arī panelisti?
Does anyone have last-minute comment? It could be brief from the audience, from the panels, very briefly, about the European values. I believe we have spoken for almost 2 hours. We do not remember then, slightly more than a year ago, people died in the central square of Kyiv under the slogan Euromaidan, under the flags of the European Union hoisted among these places of gathering. I think it's clear the European Union has very strong values, very attractive for people who want to live in the name of these values, and they were widespread among us 20 years ago. That's normal. People who want to have a normal life by this understanding, the rule of law, human rights, democracy, all these things that we take for granted. For them, these values seem very attractive if they don't have them. It's the same if we lived in an environment where there was no clean water. That would be a very important political issue for us. But once we have got this clean water, it becomes an infrastructural issue. And I agree with Andres that it's slightly unfair to ask this political enthusiasm from people, which is actually it's a practical matter. The European Union deals with these infrastructural issues of human rights and values. Once the people have the infrastructure, they will not speak about whether to pull this optical pipeline here or there. So this is quite understandable now, and not to ask them to take questions where the optic fiber should be pushed. But I believe this democratic infrastructure must continue to exist, and we must ensure that it survives. But as you said, the problem is that it has to be justified all the time because it is put opposite to this emotional attachment to the nation state, to the member states. But I believe that's not the task of the European Union. And if we speak about peace within the EU, the European Union was founded to ensure peace among the member states. It never could identify the task of protecting against external enemies. That's the NATO in its present format. And it would not be possible if there had not been also the constant involvement of the United States over the last 10 years. I think this is another view we have to take. But that's the democratic infrastructure that we are absolutely interested to see that it exists. May I one brief additional question to Paul? Is it in your view it's the infrastructure of the legitimacy of human rights and values, or it's something, or it's part of the European dream, or perhaps there's more emphasis on social matters, which also makes Europe attractive in comparison with Asia or perhaps America. Is what the authors of the conception offer, it's perhaps to really assume democracy, the element of democracy, take it for granted, but they say that the future development should be based on more involvement on competitiveness and the social element. And the social element is what the Asian countries actually try to throw away because they say it prevents competitiveness, or it is part, an inseparable part of the European dream, this very strong social infrastructure. A social policy, also within national countries, depends largely on a feeling of solidarity. People are not ready to stand and watch the taxes they pay to be given to others if they do not feel this mutual responsibility and accountability. I believe, unfortunately, in the EU, that's a problem. And it becomes a problem inside the countries. We see the very heated debate about migration and about those people who have moved to live in other countries to work there. The discussions have also at the basis this lack of solidarity with these people. And I believe that's an objective problem that exists. I do not know whether that's so easy to overcome this problem. I just wanted to add, I absolutely cannot agree with Mr. Raudseps that the unwillingness of the population to take interest in such matters because they are technical matters and people find it difficult to understand, and that's why I don't take any interest in this. We take it as a norm. We devalue such a thing as elections. We go to vote for our MPs. In actual fact, we vote for people who will take some technical decisions that we do not understand. It's simple to criticize. It's not easy to find answers. Neither Delphi nor the magazine here have not found how to inform the population about legislation in an attractive manner. Until now, there's been a failure, but it shouldn't be taken as a norm. I'd like to continue discussion, and I'd like to direct it outward and say only that the European dream from inside the EU and also in the wider context, in actual fact, peace within Europe was the engine of the Schuman Plan. But what we have in the EU now, and I believe this has been included in this report, is the leadership of the EU. Look what's going on outside EU. The peace project that is transformed outside, there's also such enlargement that the EU also refers to these values. That is the Articles 2 in the treaties. And actually, we do not read the Lisbon Treaty as our bedside reading. We read some other literature. We got used to it. We take it for granted. It's self-explanatory, understandable. And that's why Europe should be aware of the internal values, and they should invite neighbors outside the EU and encourage them to follow these values. I think that is one of the paths to take. Some may say Europe is not yet ready. I believe if we are ready, Europe will be ready. Thank you very much for the participation discussion. Thank you also to the audience. It's been quite active. Also putting emphasis, which I never ever thought about at the beginning of the discussion. I believe the summary of the discussion is that the overall feeling is the desire for a more ambitious focus Europe, which will always remain realistic in what's being done, what's being achieved. And here Mrs. Rūse also described what has been intended to achieve within one presidency, what is done together with other players in the EU. I'd like to say thank you to everybody. Andres had promised at the end of the process, there might be another report or a discussion that will summarize our views expressed in other countries, which perhaps wanted to have a very pragmatic EU without any dreams at all. But just because the views are so diverse, it's so important that we formulate the way Latvia would feel better in the EU, and that's also a reason for ourselves to give some thought to these processes. Thank you very much for their attendance, and we'll look forward to the final report in June, July, and definitely we will continue this discussion. Thank you.